Hello again, friends, and welcome to Madison BookBeat, your listener-sponsored community radio home for Madison authors, Madison topics, Madison book events, and Madison publishers. I'm your technologically impaired host, Stu Levitan. On today's show, we hit 3 of those criteria with R. Richard Dick Wagner, author of We've Been Here All Along, Wisconsin's Early Gay History, covering the period from territorial days to the 1960s. It's from our friends at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, which in September will publish his companion volume, Coming Out Moving Forward, Wisconsin's Recent Gay History. And some breaking news about Volume 1. It was just awarded the gold medal in the LGBT category by the Independent Publishers Association. In 1982, under Republican Governor Lee Dreyfus, Wisconsin became the first state in the country to adopt a gay rights law, making discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation illegal. In 1983, under Democratic Governor Tony Earl, Wisconsin became the first state to have a governor's commission on lesbian and gay issues. Wisconsin is the only state to have elected 3 openly gay members of Congress, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican. But the dairy state has not always been so friendly to non-normative sexuality. In fact, laws against gay sex predate the state. When the Wisconsin Territory was created in 1836, territorial legislators took the law against sodomy from the Michigan Territory and increased the penalty from 3 years to 5. In 1905, the Wisconsin Attorney General called oral sex this unspeakable offense, the infamous crime, degrading and disgusting. In 1928, the Supreme Court called sodomy repulsive and detestable, but too prevalent to be ignored. In the 1940s, Wisconsin criminalized even thinking gay, passing the sexual psychopath law to prosecute people whose impulsiveness of behavior rendered them sexually irresponsible, whether or not they actually acted on those supposed impulses. Even that citadel of sifting and winnowing, the University of Wisconsin, got into the gay bashing business, investigating hundreds of gay students in the 50s and early 60s, and sending many of them to therapeutic discipline. UW business manager A.W. Peterson even took the doors off the toilet stalls in the Bascom Hall men's rooms to stop gay assignations. It's part of our state's history that most people, straight or gay, don't know, but should. Because the community cannot fully know itself or be fully known by others without knowing its history. As they say, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. There is no one more qualified or appropriate to write this groundbreaking history of early gay life in Wisconsin than Dick Wagner, who is himself historic as the first openly gay member of a county board in Wisconsin. He even lives in a landmark building on Jennifer Street, which long before he came to town was a center of gay life. Dick came to Madison as a graduate student in history in 1965, getting his doctorate in 1971. In 1972, Governor Pat Lucey named him executive director of the American Revolution Bicentennial Commission. After Lucey resigned in 1977 to become ambassador to Mexico, Dick ran the executive residence for Governor Martin Schreiber until 1979, when he joined the Department of Administration as a budget analyst. Dick retired from state service in 2005. In addition to serving on the county board from 1980 to 1994, including 4 years as the first openly gay county board chair in Wisconsin, Dick's record of state and local public service is extensive. In 1983, Governor Tony Earl named him co-chair of the aforementioned Governor's Commission. That same year, he co-founded the New Harvest Foundation, a funding source for South Central Wisconsin LGBT communities. Dick stepped down last year as chair of the Madison Urban Design Commission, following service on the Plan Commission, Landmarks Commission, Wisconsin Arts Board, Wisconsin Humanities Council, and numerous other organizations. In recognition not just of his service, but the way he served, Dick was named the first recipient of the City of Madison's Jeffrey Clay Erlanger Award for Civility in Public Discourse. And on a personal note, I had the pleasure of serving with Dick on the Dane County Board from 1982 to 1987, and there is no one whose intelligence, integrity, and decency I respect more. It is a pleasure to welcome to Madison BookBeat my friend, Dick Wagner.
Thanks, Stu. You got me blushing now.
Well, I meant every word of it. Setting out to write a 2-volume history is quite an ambitious undertaking for one's supposed retirement. What were you hoping to accomplish in these 2 volumes?
I don't know that I had a definite goal. I knew there was a story there and it should be told. I met early on some of the LGBT scholars who were doing some historical things, including Alan Burby and George Chauncey, and I was admiring their works. But having worked in the political fields here in Wisconsin, I knew that the story of what we had accomplished in this state was little known and not very well understood, and needed to be there on the shelf with all those other great stories.
Now, you began your involvement in gay rights in the 1970s, just after this volume ends. How much of this early history in Wisconsin did you know at that time?
I knew only a little bit. I knew that there were like gays in Cooksville, because when I got done with my dissertation, I had some time before I started a job. And so I went down and volunteered to be an apprentice antique dealer at the Only Yesterday shop run by Marvin Rainey. And he invited me back and my friend Hank Leffler back for tea at his house where he lived with his partner, Chester Holloway. And Chester figures in the book as well. And they were the ones who had Ralph Warner's house in Cooksville. So, early crisscrossing these paths of gay men in Wisconsin was one of the things that happened in my life. I didn't have any conceptualization of it as to what its significance was, but I was picking up threads from a very early stage.
In researching the book, either through your own extensive archives or external sources, what did you learn that surprised you?
What surprised me was how I kept finding people who were interacting with other people. Like, I figured I would find that there were some gay folks here and some gay folks there. I sort of knew of Bob Neal and Edgar Hellum in Mineral Point, but what I didn't know was how they actually created networks of folks and how those networks were supportive and built community in those early days. You would find references to one another in letters or exchanges of information between them. And so clearly they had developed these networks that were very important to them. The other thing that surprised me was what I call gay scrapbooking, that they were saving things that helped them understand their identity and putting it into scrapbooks or archive type documents. And that when you didn't see yourself reflected in the larger society, this kind of scrapbooking gave you a way to reinforce and create identities that was, I think, very important to them.
And how did they reflect back on what those identities were?
Well, like Ralph Warner had scrapbooks in Cooksville. He had clipped a piece like, "Is it manly to eat salad?" And it clearly talked about sort of the Willy boy and this sort of thing in part of this story. And, so here he had found some references to sort of how gays were treated. In the end, it was concluded, okay, it is manly to eat salad. But meanwhile, they sort of digress into sort of, this caricature of this gay identity, and that was significant to him. And then there was a poem about the fairies dancing on the lawn. And so you find things down in Mineral Point. There's clippings about the early Oscar Wilde days and his tour of America and his appearance and things like that. So, they were taking these snippets, in a way cherishing them as a way to say, yes, there is this identity that's largely suppressed, but nevertheless can still be found.
We're going to get into not the Oscar Wilde tour, but the Oscar Wilde trials in a little bit, because that's where you begin the book. There are obviously some unusual aspects about Wisconsin, but Is the arc of Wisconsin's early gay history unique? I mean, other than the particulars, how different would a book about the early gay history of Minnesota or Michigan or Illinois be?
Um, there's not as many that go back as far as I did. George Chauncey in Gay New York has gone back that far, and there's a few others that have gone back that far. Most of them are sort of like encyclopedias of early gay life in their areas, with not a lot of strong analysis.
No, I mean, if there were a Dick Wagner of Michigan or Minnesota who did this book on that state, how different was the reality there than the reality here?
Having not done that state by state comparison, I'm a little loath to draw firm conclusions. I mean, I've read a lot of gay histories of other places. They're mainly about cities rather than about states. And that's one of the things that I thought was important to me, was that in this state of Wisconsin, there was a sense of how you were building networks that were across local boundaries. And so, like, there's Gay New York, George Chauncey, was replete with how much homosex was happening in the city of New York. He indicates that in that period prior to the 1930s, it was not connected with identity in any way. It was simply a lot of sex going on amongst men. And you find that here in this state too. There's a lot of reference and evidence of a lot of sex going on, even though it's all illegal. But there's some sense that I had that they were building community here as well. There's some of that in some places, but it's not really been studied a lot. So, later in the post-World War II period, you get how gay bars become central everywhere to many communities, and that becomes common across states.
As I mentioned, you came to Madison for graduate school in '65, got your doctorate in '71. So you bracketed Stonewall and what the public identifies as the start of the gay rights movement.
Right.
How much did things change in those 6 years on campus, in Madison, and around the state?
In those 6 years, not a lot from what I actually personally experienced. There was some awakening. My research in that is more of what happens after Stonewall. And by then I was doing my dissertation and off, sort of not so much on campus as much as writing and editing the dissertation. So I was not involved in that early stuff on campus. But certainly, from the 60s how Madison was in turmoil in so many ways. I mean, I was on Bascom Hill. I got the tear gas and all the other stuff that was happening during the Dow demonstrations. And I was part of the History Students Association, which was like an SDS front organization, which was organizing on the campus. So there was this sense of change coming, but a lot of it was not still publicly addressing sexuality in any way that, the ordinary person on the street would have understood. There were beginning to be gay active cells and groups, but it was still pretty sub rosa at that point.
Well, speaking of the history department, it's been a nationally renowned department since Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890s. You did your work with Merle Curdy and David Cronin, but there were other superstars there, George Mossey and Harvey Goldberg.
Right.
How known was their sexuality at the time?
I knew nothing about it. George's memoir is quite clear that he had to keep the closet door very closed in those early days when he was here on campus. However, I do remember a call from Merle Curdy when I was at his house with seminar, and it was another faculty member, and he was missing his partner, clearly from what Merle's part of the conversation was. And Merle was being very empathetic about the situation. So, obviously some of it was known to folks, but, Harvey was more out than George, and does in the early 70s, sort of the gay response, which was one of the groundbreaking early public things on Wisconsin public television about local gay community.
So something that you no doubt did not know when you came here in 1965 was that only a few years earlier there had been what our dear friend, the late Ron McCrae, called the gay purge at the university. So let's turn to the period 1950 to 1962 and the chapter you call Witch Hunts and the Fairy Deal, when the Lavender Scare actually affected more people than the Red Scare. So take us back to the early 1950s and the Cold War persecution of gays and lesbians and our own Joe McCarthy.
Our own dear Joe McCarthy from Appleton. And he was one of the promoters of all the witch hunts that starts in the 1950s. He kicks it off in Wheeling, West Virginia, with a speech to the Republican women and talking about known subversives in the State Department. Luckily for him, about the same time, other evidence by internal investigations in the State Department had uncovered a huge number of gays who were in the State Department. And the best scholar of this, David Johnson, has shown that there were actually more LGBT people fired than there were communists fired from the federal government during the witch hunts. In part, that's because it was easier to find them. They were on police record blotters because they had gotten picked up for cruising in parks. The son of Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt got picked up, Buddy Hunt, for cruising in Lafayette Square, which was still a very cruisy area late into the 70s and 80s in Washington, D.C. So he was threatened with exposure over his son being arrested for immoral purposes in Lafayette Square if he was going to run for re-election. And instead, he committed suicide in his office at the Capitol. So, it was a terrible time for gays and lesbians. There's luckily been a number of good plays lately written about this that have tried to recapture some of that spirit. But the whole McCarthy witch hunts, there were various scandals in 48. There was a whole purge of university students. But the big one was in 1962 under Dean Zillman, Dean of Men. He compiled a list of hundreds of homosexuals that he had on a file. They would call people in to protection and security and ask them to name names, a very McCarthy-ish kind of a thing. The people would actually add names to the list of people who they knew were known homosexuals, even if they hadn't had sex with them themselves, just figuring, they had to have their name. George Stambolian, who was in the French department finishing a degree, later went to the Sorbonne, and he remembered you had to lie. Louis Bosworth, who was still around, was one of those who got picked up in the purge and was denied assistance and was the main source for Ron's early story about the gay purge. And so, it was a terrible time. People were told not to finish their degrees, or they weren't going to get continued financial assistance for teaching assistantships and things like that. So it really was an attempt to purge the campus so that it would be homosexual free.
Explain the use of therapeutic discipline.
Well, this was actually the university trying to be, quote, progressive, because the option of therapeutic discipline, i.e. going to see the shrink, was to go see the jail. And so they had campus protection and security had struck a deal with the Dane County District Attorney, Dennis Maloney at the time, so that if students got arrested in town on morals charges, they would be referred to the university for the university to deal with them. And the university had a student discipline committee, and they would recommend that they see psychiatrists. I went through all the discipline records. It's amazing. There were a lot of other related sexual matters that the students were being disciplined for. A lot of the men were arrested in panty raids. Some of the men and women were arrested for having sexual relationships. None of them were deemed sick enough that they had to see a psychiatrist for any of those activities. It was only the gay men that were set to the shrinks and suspended until they had successfully completed their psychiatric treatment. And then they might or might not be readmitted.
And do we know how many people ultimately were removed, were affected by this?
I don't know how many people were ultimately affected, since not necessarily everybody would have come into a student disciplinary hearing. But there were clearly several hundreds who were affected by this, and many more, because of course the grapevine spread the word very quickly that this was going on. And so a lot of people would have self-selected to not come back to the university and to face this kind of persecution. So it's probably more than are in the files, if I had to guess.
And I'm surprised that you were able to get access to those files.
Well, the University Archives was very kind. I set up the parameters that I would not use any names, even though some of the people were actually in newspaper accounts, and so there is a matter of record. The 1948 scandal listed names of 12 individuals who were arrested in that scandal. A number of them were students, and they appeared in courts, and so their names were in the papers. But my arrangement was that I wasn't going to use any names in talking about any of these incidences. So with that, the access was okay.
You brought up the 1948 episode. The gay purge in 62 was not the first time the university took an intense interest in the sex lives of its students. Talk about what your investigation of that immediate post-war period showed about who was investigated for what and what happened to them.
Well, university deans around the country exchange notes and comments and go to meetings. And there was one who wrote a paper about while knitting at the guillotine, playing like Madame Defarge. And another comment about that our campus, like many others, had experienced an outbreak of homosexuality after the war. Part of this was that during the war, gay men, even though the army was trying to screen them out, actually served and found other gay men like themselves in the armed services. And so when they came back to campus, they were a little more determined that they were going to lead lives as gay men more than they had before. There was, like in the 1930s, only one case of a homosexual discipline case. And then in the 40s and 50s, you start getting 9, 10, 12 annually of some of these cases that are in the discipline files. And it goes constant from the 1940s up to 1962, even though 1962 is sort of the big purge. There was no let up in that whole period following World War II up until 62. And then in 62, when they finally end it, they decide, well, no, we shouldn't be concerned with the private lives of our students, either homosexual or heterosexual, any more than one or the other.
One of the we're going to get back to the experiences at Truax and during the war, but to finish just up on the gay purge aspect, one of the recurring themes throughout this early history is that the vast majority of persecutions and prosecutions are of gay men and not lesbians.
Right.
In part, that's because of the way the statutes are written. In part, I think that's because it reflects who the power structure was afraid of and who freaked them out more than the others. But there's a particularly personal reason why lesbians were not investigated and prosecuted at the University of Wisconsin. Tell us about Martha Peterson and how she dealt with Ted Zinman.
Martha Peterson, it was Zillman, not
Zillman, yes.
Right. Martha Peterson was a graduate of the University of Kansas, and at one point she's described as Kansas is a wheat field in August. And she's hired to come to the university to be Dean of Women, mainly because of a strong support from one of the female regents on the university, Mrs. Melvin Laird Sr. So she's hired. President E.B. Fred at that point introduces her to another doctor on campus, because the doctor was from Nebraska. This is Dr. Maxine Bennett. And the two of them form a couple that lasted for well over 40 years. So while Martha was Dean of Women, she battled with Ted Zillman often over student disciplinary matters. She had a more mature approach towards students, that they should be allowed to lead their own lives. The university shouldn't do so much in loco parentis. And as a lesbian, she was perhaps less interested in punishing women who were having sex. But generally, the fact that like two women could dance together in most any bar in Wisconsin, and nobody would bat an eye, it was not seen as threatening in some regards as two men having sex.
And in fact, we see a picture of Maxine Bennett on the cover of the book in her mountaineering Matterhorn attire.
Right, she was known as Mountaineering Max because she did climb the Matterhorn with an earlier partner, and she and Martha went back to the Matterhorn later in their lives.
And eventually, they were open enough that they could travel together in the corporate circles and
Right.
Be recognized as life partners.
Yes. Martha, because she went on from here to be president of Barnard College and then president of Beloit College, got invited to serve on a number of serious corporate boards, including Exxon, and other couples on these excursions they would take to go, overseas on trips would have their partners, and Martha, checked whether she could bring Dr. Maxine Bennett with her, and it was all okay. And so she and Max would travel together as partners to some of these corporate board meetings overseas.
And in her obituary, they were recognized as life partners.
Yes, right.
One of the stereotypes of gay men is their supposed attraction to the theater. And indeed, there was a cross-dressing theater troupe on campus. How much concern did the Hare's Foot Club cause the university? And was that concern legitimate?
Well, yes, there were gay men in Hare's Foot. I've heard stories that sort of when they were in the dressing room, the gay men would be on one side and the straight men would be on the other side. And it's not a surprise that cross-dressing would have some appeal to the gay men who wanted to be in theater. And the whole theater scene was sort of rife with gay folks as well, nationally. And some of it, of course, was happening here locally. But again, in '48, the university conducted an investigation of Hare's Foot because of the rumors of how many gay men were involved. And they sought to get help from the university, but Dr. Annette Washburn, who was related to Governor Cadwallader Washburn, refused to cooperate because medical records should not be provided for that kind of a purpose because of their confidentiality. So the investigation never really got very far. But again, a number of the student discipline cases involved folks who were in the theater, and they tried to sort of suppress as much of that as they could.
Do you think that theater had a role in Lorraine Hansberry's early lesbianism?
It may well have, and part of the new research on Hansberry is they're discovering that there's more earlier stuff than just the later correspondence with the latter that she did, and a member of being Daughters of Bilitis. She was involved with some of the theater productions here on campus, and from the discipline records, I know some of the men involved in those same theater productions were gay men, because they got caught up in the sweep of the university discipline procedures. So she certainly would have seen and interacted with some of these gay men during her days here, and that may have had an influence on her.
One of the aspects of your resume that I didn't mention was your role in finally bringing to fruition the Monona Terrace Community and Convention Center. And one of the reasons why the original Monona Terrace was stopped was people in power thought that Frank Lloyd Wright was an unpatriotic libertine. And it seems that there were some investigations of Taliesin which shows, as I read it, Wright was sort of a libertine, but not particularly tolerant of homosexuality.
He was not wanting to be seen as encouraging it, and he made some disparaging remarks, and he didn't want Taliesin to be known as a place for homosexuals, even though it was known as a place for homosexuals and had homosexuals there. The Kaufman son, who was an apprentice there, who was the reason that he got Falling Water Commission, was a gay man. And my own person who owned the house here, Keith McCutcheon, went out and served as a secretary to Wright for a while. And there were a number of other apprentices at Taliesin who were gay men as well. So yeah, it was about being seen as much as the reality in that case.
Okay. We've talked pretty much about the end of the book. I want to go back to the beginning now, and your look at how Wisconsin newspapers covered the trials of Oscar Wilde in 1895, both his unsuccessful libel trial and that he brought, and the prosecution for sodomy that put him in prison. Why did you start there?
This was just, a researcher's hunch. I wondered if the Wisconsin press had covered the Oscar Wilde trial, since, Oscar Wilde is sort of the paterfamilias of sort of gay life in so many ways, since he was one of the most early visible incidences of homosexuality. And so I started digging, and I found that they did cover it extensively. This was a period when newspapers would write 3 and 4 headlines for a story. Now, the wire stories all came from London, but all the headlines were written locally by the local editors. And so by looking at the headlines that the local editors would write, you could gauge their views. In a number of cases, they also wrote editorials about it. So I used it basically as an opinion poll on Wisconsin attitudes towards homosexuality in 1895. It was the best sort of gauge you could get to sort of public attitudes. And there was a whole series of themes, and one of it was, of course, criminality was entirely appropriate. There was a theme of sickness. There was a theme of impoverishment. They took his plays down from the West End. They banned his books, supposedly, from the libraries. And there was this sense of otherness. There was complaining about the mental dudes of Boston that had, worshipped Wilde when he made his American tour, and that now they should have learned that this is sort of an un-American kind of a thing, to have this kind of aestheticism that Wilde was espousing.
Were there any pockets of tolerance or progressivity in its coverage?
The only somewhat positive, well, I'll say 2 things. The Beloit Press had one positive comment in that Oscar Wilde's sister-in-law, who was Mrs. Frank Leslie, was going over to England to comfort Wilde's mother, since she had married another of Wilde's brothers. And then there was a discussion that was published in WORT, which was the German socialist paper in Milwaukee, in which they reprinted in the socialist paper an anarchist defense that came out of another paper published in Detroit. And the anarchists were basically defending homosexuality, which was not uncommon for anarchists to do. But the socialists were saying, nah, we're not having any of this. So there was this debate on the left, sort of between the anarchist and the socialist about it. So
I quoted some of the early court cases in the introduction. What was law enforcement like in the early days and the early decades of the century?
Well, I went through Madison police reports, and almost every case of sodomy was listed in their description of important crimes. And they had regular, not quite annually, but often in Madison police reports, cases of sodomy in that important crimes list. Milwaukee police reports showed that annually they would have 9, 10, 12 cases perhaps a year of sodomy. It was interesting that that kind of police enforcement was ongoing, even though it missed a lot of stuff. When we get to the Gillen reports on Waupun, they talk about sort of a number of folks who were known but never arrested. It's interesting, too, that I found recently, after, of course, I published a memoir by Joseph Caldwell about In the Shadow of the Bridge, which he wrote about going to New York. But he was raised in Milwaukee, and he describes as a young teenager going to the parks and the theaters for sex in Milwaukee in the period right after post-World War II, which matched up with the other documentation that I found in the book when I had written it. So this kind of confirmation as you keep uncovering stuff and more comes out about gay life is remarkable in some ways.
The Gillen report was the second academic study to look at this. The first was during the Progressive era, when the Committee to Investigate the White Slave Traffic and Kindred Subjects, known as the Teasdale Committee, after its chairman printed in great detail the testimony of a UW sociology professor named E.A. Ross. What did Professor Ross contribute to our understanding?
Well, Edward Alsworthy Ross was one of the great sociologists in America, and he came out strongly for the suppression of vice at that point. It was progressive to try and eliminate this immorality, and so he was strongly for its suppression. So was the socialist Congressman Victor Berger, who testified to the Teasdale Commission. So on the left, there was not much opening for any alternative sexualities at that point. Now, Gillen, though, writing in the 1930s, starts to change the dialogue. He moves, even though he's a criminologist, basically as a sociology professor, he starts writing about homosexuals more as a social construct, and as he has a whole essay about the number of people who were in Waupun convicted for sodomy. And he cites all the European authorities, Freud, he even cites Magnus Hirschfeld. He doesn't do an essay like that for the murderers, about the origins of murder, but he does it about the origins of homosexuality. So he starts to shift the discussion to a more scientific basis in his writing on crimogenesis, which is what his topic was, about the origins of crime.
This is based on a series of autobiographical essays. He has the prisoners or the inmates at the prison and the Central State Hospital right in the 30s.
There's a couple essays, but it's more interviews that he has graduate research assistants go to Waupun, and he interviews them, and he takes their life histories. If they were literate and they were willing, a number of them did write extensive essays, including one 68-page essay, which is really amazing, by a gentleman who went by the name of Labogala. And he claimed to be from the French Sudan. And he would describe how there were harems and the chiefs, and that there were Jews who had come down from Morocco to the French Sudan as well, 12 rabbis and stuff like this. But then he, in his biography, talks about how he was captured and put on a ship and taken to Scotland, where he was raised by an English lord. Now he publishes all of this in a biography, which was originally a series of articles in Scribner's, but Knopf publishes the whole collection as a history of this guy from the French Sudan. And he went around and lecturing. He was lecturing at Madison Central High, and he was lecturing at the Kenosha Methodist Church. But he actually was a man who enjoyed providing oral sex to other men. And so he got arrested in Kenosha and got sentenced to Waupun, and that's how he was there to write the essay. But then they started to investigate about possibly deporting him back to the French Sudan. And it turns out he was actually Joseph Lee instead of Labogala, and he was born the 11th child of an African-American family in Baltimore. So he actually never got deported. He's buried up in a New York prison at Attica under the name Labogala.
Wow. Go forward a couple of years to early 1945, and there's a study of 21 gay men at Truex Air Base, published as A Study of Homosexual Adult Males. It's another UW professor of physiological chemistry who's analyzing the urine samples to determine exactly what?
Well, there was a theory that perhaps an imbalance in hormones caused homosexuality. Now, this theory was sort of popular in this period. Kinsey even mentions it, even though he disagrees with this theory, before Kinsey had actually published his major book, though he does cite this Truex study in his list of bibliography. So the Dr. E.L. Servinghouse has this theory, and he teams up with a major at the base who's a psychiatrist. They take urine samples from this sample of some 20 men, and they compare it with urine samples of another group of men who they assume are not homosexuals. I don't quite know how they prove that. They tried to sort of do analysis of what the hormone balances were and stuff like that. The scientific numbers didn't show them anything. But meanwhile, they took case histories from these gay men at Truax. And so you begin to get a picture of gay life in Madison area at Truax in this 1940 study. Basically, all of the men were rejecting therapy. They didn't want it. They didn't think they needed it. So, this is a period when the military was screening out all gay people as, sick by using psychiatrists to try and catch them, though they failed miserably as hundreds of thousands of gay men served in the military amongst the millions of Americans who did. The Truax study proves that they missed, obviously, too. Anyway, the gay men themselves were rejecting this ascription of illness, and they didn't want therapy. And then there was this little sideline about how 4 of them were members of an organized group. This is 1945. You have an organized group of gay men in Madison in 1945. This is many decades before Stonewall was organizing gay men. So, there's something going on here that people aren't aware of.
We're talking with Dick Wagner. His award-winning book is We've Been Here All Along, Wisconsin's Early Gay History, from our friends at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. There's a delightful little twist here in terms of Truax, because the 2 men who preserved the historic Cornish settlement in Mineral Point and established the Pendarvis House restaurant end up cooking and managing supplies at Truax. Take us back a decade for the story of Bob Neal and Edgar Hellam, who are also pictured on the cover of the book. Talk about what they did at Mineral Point, how that fits into Cooksville and New Glarus, and what appears to be a tradition of gay historic preservationists.
Well, there are a lot of gay historic preservationists. That's no doubt about that. I'll own up to that too, living in my 1857 house. But one of them, Edgar Hellam, was from Stoughton, and he knew Ralph Warner, who was the man who had preserved the house next door, which became a gay household for many decades in Cooksville. And from Ralph Warner, Edgar Hellam learned about collecting antiques and upgrading to your collection. As you got a better piece, you'd sell off the piece you had before. Bob Neal was a native of Mineral Point, and Bob got hooked up with Siri Mom, who was a decorator. She was also the ex-wife of Somerset Maugham, who was another gay man who ended up living with an American partner in the south of France. But Siri Maugham had a decorating shop in London, New York, and Chicago. And so Bob Neal got hired to help in the Chicago shop. As the Depression got worse, Siri closed the Chicago shop. Bob went and worked in the New York shop for a while, and then that got closed. And so he went to London and worked in Siri Maugham's London shop. And he has a series of correspondence back to Mineral Point in which he talks about his experiences in London. If you compare what he's talking about with the book about gay London, there's a lot of coincidence about the sites. He also is very chatty about certain other folks, and that he had a letter from New York to a female impersonator in London. So clearly, while he was in Chicago and in New York, he had been in gay circles. And then he comes back from London and he meets Edgar Hellam. And they both, for $10, buy Pendarvis, the first house, and they decide to restore it, to operate a little antique business and tea house there, which becomes a great dining establishment recommended by Duncan Hines, the great food critic, after the war. And they're serving pasties, which is an old Cornish dish. And Bob helped revive a lot of the Cornish lore in Mineral Point. He did have a Cornish grandmother. And later on, Edgar was awarded a certificate of something by the Cornish Bards Society, even though Edgar was Norwegian by heritage. So.
And how were they welcomed into Mineral Point, into the life of Mineral Point?
It varied. I mean, Bob was, of course, a local boy. They became big sort of proteges of the State Journal reporter who wrote about them often. And she felt they weren't well received in Mineral Point. Indeed, there were some families that wouldn't let their kids wait table down at the Pendarvis house because of the reputation that Bob and Edgar had. There were two men living in a house together, and they were always described as partners in the news clippings of the day. And some of them wrote up about how they were like Cornish pixies, which is, of course, a type of fairy. And so the code words about these two youthful, artistic men were fairly clearly implying what they were and who they were. But later Bob served on the Mineral Point Council, helped get the first historic district in Madison, in the state of Wisconsin, created in Mineral Point. So, you know, they were well respected in certain other ways for their careers down there.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Tell us about the fourth picture on the cover, Ted Pierce.
Ted Pierce was an African-American gentleman. He came from a Madison family that lived here for quite some time. His grandmother, Hattie, lived to be over 100 years old. Her birthday was celebrated by Wisconsin governors. The person who served as his father, who was actually his uncle, was a messenger at the state capitol in the governor's office, a role that Ted himself later assumed under Governor Phil LaFollette. Ted was a fairly open person about who he was. There's sort of clearly influences. He's shown as a young kid in a little Lord Fauntleroy suit his mother sewed for him. He was described as a fashion plate at East High, where he attended. He also went to the university for a couple years. He had an extensive correspondence with a number of other gay men and dance fans. He even wrote to like Merce Cunningham in New York about ballet issues. He would welcome wayward young men who might need a place to stay. And he also welcomed African Americans who weren't always necessarily welcome at hotels. Canada Lee, a great African American actor, stayed at Ted Pierce's house. He was quite the center of local gay life here in Madison in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
For that time period, was the gay community more open to intersectionality and having African American friends than a straight community aspect was?
I don't have the comparison to be able to tell you, but it certainly was. There were a number of people who clearly had African American partners and white partners together. The records show that. Ted was part of this whole East Side circle of folks, and he socialized with Keith McCutcheon and his partner. There was, I think, perhaps more openness, and Keith, I think because of Ted, got involved in a reception for the NAACP that they were having for Canada Lee, who was coming to town. So, you know, there was some overlapping and interconnection between those communities.
And how did Jennifer Street become the hub of gay social life in Madison, particularly 739 Jennifer Street?
It was the two guys who lived here, Keith McCutcheon and Joe Koberstein. Keith was from out west of here, and he lived along the Wisconsin River. I like to call him the poet of the sandbars because he wrote poems about the Wisconsin River sandbars. I think he probably knew about the nude beach at Mazomanie as well. He attended the university in the 20s. Through a niece of his partners, I got a lot of his papers, including like the essays he wrote as a student at the university. He talks about friendship with men. And then he starts to write poetry. And there's clearly poetry in which he finally fully accepts his homosexuality. And the last group of poems that he published, about 2 pieces of Venetian glass, talks about the force of love and held in these very fragile goblets, pair of goblets of Venetian glass that, a misstep would crush, but yet it held the force of life for them. So, he was a remarkable guy.
We are about out of time. What are the most important lessons you want people to take away from the book?
The most important lessons I want people to take away is that gay life happened in the Midwest, not just on the coast. While we think all the early activity was in the New York and San Francisco or LA area, a lot did happen in those places. Things were happening here in the Midwest as well, and that these people who I discovered found ways to liberate themselves from the oppression of society. They had to be careful, and they weren't out in terms that we would think of it as today. But they knew who they were, they had established their identities, and they had built support networks. And that's a very basic premise of liberation that occurred here well before Stonewall.
My thanks to Dick Wagner. The book, again, is We've Been Here All Along, Wisconsin's Early Gay History. It's available at all local bookstores. Dick will be back with us in September when the Historical Society Press publishes Volume 2, coming out Moving Forward, Wisconsin's Recent Gay History. There are a number of book events coming up this week. You can find out about them at mysterytomebooks.com and the wisconsinbookfestival.org. Next week on Madison BookBeat, we celebrate the 79th birthday of the greatest and most important singer-songwriter since Homer with Larry Ratso Sloman, author of On the Road with Bob Dylan. I cannot wait. On behalf of engineer Liz Stottleman, News and Public Affairs Director Shali Pittman, and all of us here at Madison BookBeat, I'm Stu Levitan. Thank you for joining us. Now, as Ben Sidran plays us out with a little bit of Little Sherry, please stay tuned for Alex Wilding White and All Around Jazz. You are listening to WORT 89.9 FM Madison, listener-sponsored community radio.
This is the Insurgent Radio Kiosk for Tuesday. This is the Insurgent Radio Kiosk for Monday, May 18th.
I love those nature shows that probe the behavior and intelligence of birds, elephants, and other fellow creatures. However, there's one exotic critter that shows have ignored.